I never thought I'd fall in love on a farm. I'm a city guy, through and through, or at least I thought I was. My whole life had been concrete and coffee shops, late nights at bars with exposed brick walls, dating apps that felt more like window shopping than actual connection. But when my uncle called, asking if I wanted to spend a summer helping out at his farm upstate, something in me said yes. Maybe it was the breakup I was still nursing. Maybe it was turning 30 and feeling like I hadn't figured anything out yet. Or maybe I just needed to remember what silence sounded like. The drive up was longer than I expected. 3 hours of highway, slowly giving way to rolling hills and fields that stretched out like they had nowhere better to be. I pulled up to my uncle's property just as the sun was starting to dip, painting everything in that golden hour light that makes even old barns look romantic. Uncle Jim came out to greet me, his weathered face breaking into a grin. He'd always been the family member who didn't ask too many questions, didn't pressure me about settling down or finding a nice girl. I think he knew. He never said anything, but there was an understanding between us. That's when I saw him. Evan. He was coming in from the fields, his t-shirt stained with dirt and sweat, work gloves tucked into his back pocket. He had this way of moving that was both confident and careful, like someone who knew exactly where his body was in space. Dark hair that curled at the ends, sun-kissed skin, and these eyes that were somewhere between green and hazel depending on the light. He looked up as I got out of my car, and our eyes met for just a second, long enough for my stomach to do this weird flip that I hadn't felt in years. Uncle Jim introduced us. Evan's handshake was firm, his palm calloused. He smiled, friendly but reserved, and I noticed he held eye contact just a beat longer than necessary. Or maybe I imagined it. God knows I'd imagined things before, reading into every glance from a straight guy, hoping for something that was never there. Those first few days, I fumbled my way through farm work like a toddler learning to walk. I'd never realized how much I didn't know about actual physical labor. Evan was patient, showing me how to properly lift hay bales without throwing out my back, how to fix a fence post, how to read the animal's behavior. He didn't talk much while we worked, but when he did, his voice had this low, steady quality that I found myself wanting to hear more of. We'd start early, before the heat became unbearable. I'd stumble out of the guest house at 5:30, still half asleep, and find Evan already at work, like he'd been up for hours. Sometimes he'd have coffee ready, 2 thermoses sitting on the fence post. He never made a big deal about it, just nodded toward them as I approached. Those small gestures started to mean everything. I learned about him in pieces. He'd grown up in a town about 20 miles away, had been working farms since he was 15. His dad had passed when he was young, and his mom had raised him and his 2 sisters on her own. He sent most of his money home. He was 26, 4 years younger than me, but he seemed older in some ways, grounded, sure of himself in a way I'd never managed to be. About 2 weeks in, we were working on repairing the roof of one of the smaller barns. It was brutally hot, and we'd both stripped down to tank tops. I was acutely aware of him next to me, the way his muscles moved as he hammered, the small tattoo on his shoulder blade that looked like coordinates. I tried not to stare, but I caught him looking at me too, quick glances when he thought I wasn't paying attention. We took a break, sitting in the shade with bottles of water that weren't nearly cold enough. The air felt thick, heavy with humidity and something else I couldn't name. Evan leaned back against the barn wall. His eyes closed, and I watched a bead of sweat trail down his neck. I wanted to reach out and trace its path with my finger. Instead, I asked him if he ever wanted to do anything else. Leave farming behind. His eyes opened, and he looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. He said he'd thought about it when he was younger. Had dreams of being a teacher, maybe, working with kids. But life had other plans, and he'd made peace with that. Then he asked me why I'd really come to the farm. The question caught me off guard. I could have given him the easy answer, the one I'd given my uncle. Needed a change of pace, wanted to help out, curious about farm life. But something about the way he was looking at me, patient and open, made me tell the truth. I told him about Marcus, my ex-boyfriend of 3 years, how I'd thought we were building something real until I found out he'd been seeing someone else for 6 months, how I'd felt so stupid for not noticing, for being so invested in a future that only existed in my head, how I'd needed to get away from everything that reminded me of him, of us, of who I'd thought I was going to be. Evan listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said he was sorry that happened to me, that I deserved better. The simplicity of it, the sincerity in his voice, made my chest ache. He reached over and squeezed my shoulder, just for a second, but I felt the warmth of his hand long after he pulled away. After that, something shifted between us. We started talking more, real conversations that stretched into the evenings after work was done. We'd sit on the porch of the guest house, watching the fireflies come out, and he'd tell me about his sisters, about his mom who was too stubborn to accept help even though he knew she needed it. I told him about growing up in the city, about coming out to my parents when I was 21, about the relief and terror of finally being honest about who I was. He listened, like every word mattered. One night, about a month into my stay, we were sitting closer than usual. Our shoulders were almost touching, and I was hyper-aware of the space between us, the way it seemed to pulse with possibility. I'd had a beer, just enough to make me brave, and I asked him if he'd ever dated anyone seriously. He got quiet, his jaw working like he was deciding something. Then he said, "Yeah, once. In high school. Her name was Sarah, and she was sweet, but it never felt right. He'd broken up with her before graduation, told her he needed to figure himself out. I asked if he'd figured himself out yet. He turned to look at me, and in the dim porch light, his eyes were dark and serious. He said he was getting there. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. The air between us felt electric, charged with everything we weren't saying. I thought he might kiss me. I wanted him to kiss me so badly it hurt. But instead, he stood up, said it was getting late, and went to his truck. I watched his taillights disappear down the driveway and felt like I'd missed something crucial. The next few days were torture. I kept replaying that moment, wondering if I'd misread everything. Evan was friendly but careful, like he was maintaining a distance he hadn't bothered with before. I convinced myself I'd ruined whatever friendship we'd built, that I'd made him uncomfortable by being too obviously interested. Then came the storm. We'd been watching the clouds build all afternoon, dark and threatening. Uncle Jim had gone into town for supplies, and Evan and I were rushing to get the animals secured before it hit. The first drops started falling as we were closing up the chicken coop, and then suddenly it was a downpour. We ran for the barn, laughing and soaked through in seconds. Inside, the sound of rain on the metal roof was deafening. We stood there dripping, catching our breath, and I became acutely aware that we were alone, that his shirt was plastered to his chest, that he was looking at me with an intensity that made my knees weak. He took a step toward me, then another. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He raised his hand like he was going to touch my face, then stopped himself. I couldn't take it anymore. I asked him what was happening between us, if I was imagining it. His jaw clenched, and for a second I thought he'd deny it. But then he said no, I wasn't imagining it. That he'd been trying not to feel what he was feeling, that it scared the hell out of him. I asked him why he was scared. He said because he'd never felt this way about anyone before. Not Sarah, not anyone, and definitely not another guy. My voice was barely a whisper when I told him I'd been feeling it too, from that first day, that I hadn't been able to stop thinking about him. He closed the distance between us, and suddenly, his hands were on my face, his forehead pressed against mine. He was shaking slightly, and I realized this wasn't just new for him, it was terrifying. I told him we could go slow, that we didn't have to do anything he wasn't ready for. He kissed me. Soft at first, tentative, like he was asking a question. I kissed him back, and something in him seemed to break open. His hands slid into my wet hair, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate. We stumbled backward until I was pressed against the barn wall, and I could feel his heart racing against my chest, matching the rhythm of my own. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, he looked stunned, like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. But he was smiling, this beautiful, genuine smile that made him look younger. We spent the rest of the storm in that barn, talking and kissing and figuring out how our bodies fit together. He told me he'd known something was different about him since he was a teenager, but he'd never let himself explore it. Growing up in a small town, being the man of the house after his dad died, He'd felt like he had to be a certain way, strong, traditional, straight. But being around me had made him question everything he'd been telling himself. The summer took on a different quality after that. We were careful around my uncle, though I suspected he knew something had changed. But when we were alone, we were inseparable. We'd sneak away during lunch breaks to kiss behind the equipment shed. At night, after Uncle Jim went to bed, Evan would come to the guest house and we'd lie tangled together in the narrow bed, talking until we fell asleep. He was gentle and curious, learning what I liked, letting me learn him. Every touch felt significant, like we were writing something important in a language only we understood. He told me about his fears one night, his voice quiet in the darkness. He was afraid of what his family would think, what the town would say. He'd built his whole identity around being a certain kind of man, and he didn't know how to reconcile that with wanting me. I told him he didn't have to figure it all out at once, that this was his journey, and he could take it at his own pace, but selfishly, I was terrified too. Because my time at the farm was finite, and I hadn't let myself think about what would happen when summer ended. As August approached, that reality became impossible to ignore. I'd need to go back to the city, back to my job and my apartment and my life. Evan would stay here or move on to the next farm, the next season. We didn't talk about it directly, but it hung between us like a weight. Our kisses became more urgent, tinged with the desperation of knowing they were numbered. One evening, we were lying in the grass behind the barn, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Evan was quiet, tracing patterns on my arm with his finger. Then he said something that stopped my heart. He said if he ever had a son, he'd want to name him after me, that I'd changed his life in a way he couldn't fully explain, that before me, he'd been going through the motions, but now he felt awake, alive. I didn't know what to say. The enormity of it, the vulnerability in his voice, made my eyes sting with tears. I told him he'd changed my life too, that I'd come here broken and angry, convinced I'd never trust anyone again, and he'd shown me that real connection was possible, that love didn't have to be complicated or painful, that it could be as simple as two people choosing each other every day. He kissed me then, slow and sweet, and I knew I was in love with him. Completely, terrifyingly in love. And I knew I couldn't leave without at least trying to figure out how to make this work. My last week at the farm, we finally had the conversation we'd been avoiding. I told him I didn't want this to end, that I knew long distance was hard, that we'd only known each other for 3 months, but I wanted to try. He was quiet for a long time, and my heart sank. I thought he was going to say no, that it was too complicated, that he needed time to figure himself out on his own. But then he said yes. He wanted to try too. He'd been thinking about it, and maybe it was time to make some changes in his life. He couldn't promise he'd be ready to be out publicly right away, but he wanted to work toward it, and in the meantime, we could visit each other. He'd come to the city, experience my world. I'd come back to the farm whenever I could. We'd figure it out together. That last night, we stayed up until dawn, memorizing each other. The way his laugh sounded when I said something unexpected. The small scar on his collarbone from a childhood accident. The way he said my name, like it was something precious. We made promises in the dark, the kind that felt both impossible and inevitable. Leaving was harder than I'd imagined. Uncle Jim hugged me goodbye, slipping an envelope with more money than I'd earned into my hand despite my protests. Evan walked me to my car, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression carefully neutral. But when I hugged him, he held on tight, his face buried in my neck, and I felt him shake with the effort of not crying. I whispered that I'd call him when I got home. He nodded, not trusting his voice. I pulled back, cupped his face in my hands, and kissed him one more time, soft and lingering and full of promise. Then I got in my car and drove away, watching him get smaller in my rearview mirror until he disappeared. That was 8 months ago. We're still together. It hasn't been easy. The distance is hard, and there are nights when I ache to touch him, to fall asleep next to him. He's still working on coming out to his family, taking it one step at a time. But we talk every day. He visits once a month, and I go back to the farm whenever I can. We're building something real, something that started in a barn during a summer storm and has grown into the most honest relationship I've ever had. Last week he told me he's been saving money, that he's thinking about making a bigger change, maybe moving closer to the city, not giving up farm work entirely, but finding something that would let us be together more often. And someday, when we're ready, he wants to adopt. Give a kid the kind of home he wished he'd had, where they could be whoever they needed to be. When he said that, I remembered his words from that evening watching the sunset, about naming his son after me. And I realized he wasn't just talking about a name. He was talking about legacy, about building a life that honored what we'd found together. A life where love wasn't something to hide or be ashamed of, but something to celebrate and pass on. I never thought I'd fall in love on a farm, but I did. And it taught me that sometimes the things we're running from lead us exactly where we need to be. That courage looks different on everyone, and real strength is being vulnerable enough to let someone in. Evan showed me that. And whatever happens next, wherever this journey takes us, I know we'll face it together. Because that's what love is, not the easy beginning or the dramatic gestures, but the choice to keep showing up, day after day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And I choose him. Every single day, I choose him.